The last topic, third topic, which is loss management.
Mhm.
And I quite often get involved at the end of the retention period because the vendor and the purchaser want my assistance with not only calculating because we look after the master spreadsheet for each settlement, but also just some help with interpreting the contract. Because really, in contracts, for the retention period, we only really see, is it two instances? I'm trying to think. Is there two instances of loss management? They are where the property is sold by another agency or agent other than the purchaser that bought the rent roll. And secondly, the owner or landlord moves in. Is that it? Probably the only two instances, aren't they?
Or they change agents.
Or they change agents. Exactly. So it's
Yeah.
terminated. And you've
Yeah.
got, so what does that mean actually? Because that's a really good point. So what should we have in the contract, firstly, in terms of what a termination notice looks like? Because that'll cover all of those aspects. And secondly, um, what about mismanagement? I mean, that's a
Mm.
real
It's a very
grey
subjective.
area, and I just go, whoa, hold on, how do we define that if there has been mismanagement? So what should we be doing with retention and loss management?
Well, look, I think with lost managements, there's the contract can only really capture what is not a lost management, right? So a lost management is not, you mentioned um, instances of a sale if the purchaser sells it. So if they sell it, they're entitled to a commission. They're not then entitled to claim on the retention. Um, if then we get down to the nitty-gritty of like, okay, well, if the owner takes possession, they move back in, you can claim it. If the owner sells with another agent, you can claim it. If the owner moves to another agency for consolidation, whatever the reason is, you can claim it unless they claim mismanagement. So, then it comes down to, well, is mismanagement as at the date that they're terminating, or is it down the track? And the reason I say that is, we had a retention dispute last month where, as at the time that the management was terminated, really lovely email from the landlord came in. Thank you so much. I'm going to be giving it to XYZ because I have a close relationship with them, whatever
Mm,
the case may be. And obviously, the requirement for a loss management as well is that you need to get that notice of termination in writing during the retention period, which is a really clear defined period. Now, the actual date of termination can vary. So, some contracts, depending on who you're acting for, will say that the notice of termination has to take effect within the retention period too. Um, or up to say 1 to 3 months after the end of the retention. And we'd say up to 3 months because there's legislation around 90-day notice periods and whatnot. So it would seem commercially fair that if someone is terminated, the day before the end of retention, but the actual date of termination is, say, 3 months later, the purchaser should still be able to claim that because
mm,
also within that 3 month period, the tenant can move out at any time.
yeah.
Now, the mismanagement aspect, we try to really drill down on that as well because it is very subjective. What you and I think is mismanagement might not be what
Mm,
purchaser Joe thinks is mismanagement. Some agencies have really different expectations on returning phone calls, acting on instructions, issuing rent increases, rent reviews, all that kind of stuff. Doing really prompt routines as opposed to other agencies who might take a bit more of a relaxed approach or might not document their KPIs as stringently. So in this instance we had last month, the notice of termination came in. Thank you very much for your management. It's been great. We're going over to agency down the road because my son has a good relationship with someone there. Great. Fast forward 3 months, we're finalizing the retention. We submit the list of loss managements. The vendor takes that list and decides to call everybody, as
mm,
is their right. They then produce an email which the landlord had sent as at that date saying, oh, well, the real reason I decided to terminate the management was because, the guy didn't call me back for 2 days. I asked him to increase the rent. He only suggested $5 instead of $10, whatever the case may be.
mm.
Pardon me. So it got into a bit of an argy-bargy over, okay, well, we've got this contemporaneous notice of termination received during the retention period that says everything is great, thank you so much, versus 3 months later, this allegation of mismanagement.
Mm.
You said, well, how can you rely on that allegation of mismanagement 3 months later when, as at that date, that is what the landlord said? Now, you and I know, especially me having worked in real estate, landlords aren't necessarily going to want to give you the right answer at the right time.
Yeah.
You know, when they're terminating, they're not going to want confrontation. They're not going to want to stir the pot. They're going to be like, thanks so much for everything you did, but, we're consolidating for these reasons. So, I don't doubt that potentially that landlord did have legitimate reasons for terminating due to mismanagement.
Mm.
The contract didn't have any requirement in there that the purchaser had to notify the vendor the moment they got loss management. Now,
Mm.
some contracts do. We're seeing it more and more because the vendors want to be able to get that information in real time so that they can then contact the
Mm.
landlords and get information as to, well, why are you really terminating? Can I save your business? What can we do, etc. So we're finding in some instances people are tripping up over the deadlines in the contracts. They're not complying with
Yeah.
them properly, which puts their retention at risk. Um, and at the same time, I think there's always going to be subjectivity and then commerciality come into effect when you're dealing with an allegation of mismanagement.
So,
Because, yeah,
and on that, I mean, if you do have an element of mismanagement, if you have a clause in the contract that says the purchaser must notify the vendor within, I don't know, whether it's two,
3 days.
3 days of the notice of termination, it gives the vendor an opportunity to say, well, hold on, let's have a look at this. Why? And bring the conversation in with the landlord. The three of them, purchaser, vendor, landlord, can discuss it, either save it or there's a real grievance there from the landlord, and it determines at that point in time that there was some significant
Yeah,
mismanagement. Yeah.
yeah. And again, mismanagement, in that deal we did last month, I'm not going to mention any names, but there was a lot of that we were acting for the purchaser. The vendor solicitor was really pushing back on like a personality clause because
Yeah.
they were trying to say that if the purchaser managed the properties in a different manner and somebody
Yeah.
then terminated that we couldn't claim. And we really pushed back on that because we said, well, how can you have a personality clause just because somebody doesn't like the way
Yeah.
in how you manage it? You can't rely on that. And I guess the biggest difference in that matter was our client was a lot more progressive with technology and was, paperless office and all that kind of stuff, whereas the vendor was very, older school in that paper, they used REST or whatever the case may be. And then to transfer all those landlords into a more modern type setup, he
Mm.
was
Mm.
rightfully concerned that some of those landlords might not like, the setup. But yeah, we pushed hard on that personality clause. We got it knocked out of the contract initially, but because then the question is, well, is it actually mismanagement or is it just they don't like the style in how their
Yeah.
property is
Yeah.
being
And
managed going
that's
forward? And you can
so
never put
hard.
a
Yeah.
definition on that.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Wow. Okay. So we've covered a lot. POIs, we've covered off on the ingoing condition reports, and we've also covered off on loss management. I mean, we've only just touched the surface
Yeah, we
on
could keep going.
three pain points or
Yeah,
cause issues in contracts. But what we do know is you've got to get these clauses right, or at least have them in some form so you're giving the contract every bit of chance of success. Because
yeah,
that's what it's about. It's not about, oh, well, I've got this, therefore I win. It's about a successful and peaceful, hopefully, transaction, which helps both parties. It's not about, oh, well, I got one over you, or I've got more wins. It's about a successful, harmonious contract. Don't you agree? Yeah.
absolutely. And I think what, people forget is that once the retention ends, and the
Mm.
purchaser's on their own to, manage this asset with no protections then, other than a restraint. But a vendor's not necessarily going to breach a restraint. But it's so important that during that retention period, the purchaser is really getting in there, is contacting all those landlords, is familiarizing themselves with the properties and not just
Yeah.
leaving it to the
Yeah.
team to, pick it
And
up. Because once that retention ends, What protection do
Oh,
you have?
you bring up,
Yeah.
and I mean, we could talk about this on other discussions as well. I mean, getting in there when you own the rent roll and calling your landlords, getting to know them. I call it shake the tree. People don't like it, but shake the tree.
Yeah.
You know, and that's important because share sales versus re-sign. In some respects, the re-sign, you're shaking the tree before you get to
Mm.
settlement. With the share sale, you're not. Therefore, you've got to shake the tree during the retention. And there are positives, negatives, ups and downs in that respect. So,
Yeah.
great. Look, fantastic. You've been awesome, and I think Swaab do a great job with every contract they prepare, whether it's acting for the vendor or the purchaser. And it's really important that you do honestly have a good specialist like yourself on your side, because if you don't, getting back to it, you're not giving the contract and the sale the best chance of success. And I think that's the
Absolutely.
important
Yeah.
thing. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank
Look, it
you.
was a good session,
Yeah.
and look, I really do hope that we do more transactions together.
We do. We have a lot of fun at the end of it when everyone's happy because that's the main goal is making sure everyone gets to the end and everyone's as happy as they can be.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Sarah.
Matt.
Thanks for your time. Cheers.
All
Bye.
right. Bye.